guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. Today we are talking about topwater. We are talking about that magical moment that happens in the springtime where all of a sudden the bass start looking up. They start being willing to take a shot at the surface to go up and eat those topwater baits. More specifically, we're talking about how to know when that moment has arrived. Because there is nothing worse than being out on the water, thinking that you're on the best pattern going, and then later finding out that one of your buddies or one of your competitors was on an absolutely awesome early spring topwater bite. So what are the indicators? How do you know? How do you know when it's go time so you're not wasting your time? Well, it's pretty simple actually. There are a handful of indicators. Each lake is different. Now this is just a rule of thumb that you guys can work off of so you know when it's time to go take that first shot. But as a rule of thumb, if your lake has grass in it, like heavy grass that will start to grow up towards the surface, your lake will go first. It will go sooner to a topwater bite than an impoundment that doesn't have a lot of grass in it. Generally speaking, in those grassy fisheries, the first indicator that it's topwater time. Now this isn't your first blow up, because your first blow up can come early in the season. That just one-off fish that's willing to take a shot at the surface, that's different than the actual topwater pattern. The pattern, your best bet is to wait until you see that first piece of green grass. Now I'm not talking about grass that's grown to the surface and laid over. I'm talking about you're bottom fishing with a jig or anything else, and you pull up something off the bottom and you reel up and it's actual growing grass. That is typically an indicator that it's go time. Now, people will tell you, 60 degrees, 61 degrees is that magic number where they eat topwater. I don't buy it. We have blasted topwater fish in water in the 40s and the 50s. There's a lot more to it than just water temperature. So while that's a great rule of thumb, 60 degrees is a great rule of thumb, it's not necessarily an indicator of what's actually happening. So the one thing that you want to look for is that fresh, clean, growing grass. If you've got that, it's time to move up shallow and take a look. The second thing that you want to look for, the second indicator, is bait fish in the water. And the reason why I say that is typically the bait fish, whether you have little tiny minnows or big minnows or bluegills or crappie or anything else, whether you have shad, regardless of what it is, the bait fish will spend the winter out in deep water because they're insulated and the water's warmer down deep during the wintertime. But in the spring, that transition will happen. That warmer water starts to be up shallow, close to the cover, and that bait fish will move in. The second you see bait fish, I don't care if bass are blowing up on them yet or not. The second with your eyes you see bait fish up in the shallows, you see a little school swim by, or you're reeling a crankbait and a little bait fish jumps up out of the water in front of that crankbait. Something that tells you those bait fish are shallow. It's time to start looking for that topwater bite. Those are the two biggest indicators. Now, we did a video a few weeks back. Tim talked to you guys about spring topwater and he talked about the bait. So I'm not going to go into it in depth, but I know some of you guys missed that video. So I'll give you a very, very quick rundown. Essentially, the first style of bait that you want to throw is something with a cupped face. A walking bait, a popper, but anything with a cupped face. Here's a rover. These are the baits Tim talked about. That rover got that little bit of a cupped face. This one's pretty battle scarred. The popper, of course. That big bubble walker, we talked a lot about that. That is such a big fish catcher in the early spring. Evergreen shower blows. Most of these are walking baits, but the reason we say a cupped face is that cupped face slows that bait down. So some walking baits are very wide gliding baits. That can be a mistake early spring because again, you have pretty cold water. Those fish don't want to travel far, but that cupped face will typically make it a tighter walking bait. The next bait, and by the way, there's a bunch more tips coming, so hang with us. But the next bait is the Whopper Whopper. Tim talked a lot about that and why you should throw it. And then your last bait is the frog, and we did not talk about the frog last time. But the frog is a major, major player in the early spring because you can get it right up in the cover. So here's what I want you guys to do. Once you see one of those two indicators, shallow grass or shallow bait fish, or at least grass beginning to grow, here's what I want you to do. Go out fishing in the evening, that late afternoon, when that sun is still up high. That's going to be the hottest part of the day in the early spring. That's where the water has had time to warm up throughout the day and it's still got sunlight on it. That's when it will be your very, very best odds. Now the bass are going to move into cover. This is why lakes that have grass in them are typically the ones that go first. I want you to think about this. It's a strike zone thing. What I mean by that, let's take a jig as an example, okay? And then we're gonna apply it to topwater. If you have a fish that's sitting on a log and you hop a jig 6 feet away, that fish is not very likely to swim 6 feet to eat that jig. But if you have a jig and you're 6 inches away, it should come out and eat it. So when those bass move up really, really shallow to get warm, they're not just doing it looking for food, they're doing it to get warm and to look for food. So when they go into those shallows, they typically want to get up against a piece of structure, either grass or a lay down log or a dock piling. They still want to be in the sun, but because they are getting ultra shallow for the warmth, they're uncomfortable, they're vulnerable to predators. So they want to be in cover. So a fishery that has a lot of grass in it, a lot of shallow cover, is the place where they're willing to move up the earliest because they can get ultra shallow, get warm, and be protected and safe. And then as a bonus to us, you can catch them. So that's why that's the first place. So if your lake doesn't have that grass, that's okay. Wait until you start to see that bait fish shallow, and then late in the day, while the sun is still up, go to the very, very backs of the pockets. The farthest back in shallow water. If you have one cove where it comes in 20 feet deep and then boom, immediately jumps up to shallows, or you have another cove where it's a slow taper and then it comes up, go to the one that's a slow taper. The fish are more likely to be in the back of that because again, this is about warmth as much as it's about eating in the early spring. I hope that helps. Does that make sense? They'd rather be in that longer shallow area because it will warm up first. Normally, bass want that quick deep water access, but this is a different scenario. This is about getting warm. So once you know which places to be, run the backs of those pockets. If you get bit at all, I mean even one time, it's not random. You may have caught the only fish that's moved into that pocket so far, but it was not random. Take that pattern and run it on every similar pocket. If you do that and it's not working yet, just give it a few more warm days, try again, because you're only days away from that wide open topwater bite. Now the reason I brought up the frog, because most people think of a frog as a middle of summer bait, you know, fish in slop and heavy cover. But early spring, like I said, those fish want to be as shallow as they can get. They'll be up there in 6 inches, a foot of water, but they're going to be tight to cover. So if you're throwing a big walking bait or a big popper right up against that cover, you just get a lot of snags because you're throwing it right in the mix. The benefit of the frog is that you can put it in that exact same zone, right in there tight on that cover with no risk of getting snagged. So when you're trying to find that pattern, find that first topwater bite, that's a great way to go as well. Once you're on the pattern, once you know that they're eating it, you can fine tune it. Switch between those baits, and we'll link all those baits down in the video description as well as the gear to throw it, just like every other video. But when you're first starting out, just pick a bait. If your aim isn't perfect, start with a frog so that you don't blow up the backs of those pockets, get snagged in every one of them and ruin your pattern. Start with that frog, and then if a fish eats it, Now you know it's time to fine tune, move your way through those baits until you find the one that they're willing to eat the most. It's probably going to be the popper first thing. That's where I almost always start, is with that small popper. And the moment they eat that, I go to a big popper to see if I can catch a big fish. Guys, I hope that helps you. We don't want you to miss that topwater bite this spring. That is one of the most exciting ways to catch big bass, or to catch any bass for that matter. And there's nothing worse than finding out the pattern was going and you didn't know about it. So this spring, ignore water temperature, ignore what the book tells you to do. If you start feeling that warm air, that grass starts to grow, that bait fish shows up, it is go time. You start checking those pockets, check them over and over and over, and you'll be the guy that's on the front end of that topwater bite instead of the guy that didn't know about it. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. We appreciate you guys. We'll talk to you soon.